Hello, everyone, and welcome to this episode of Inlay Terms. I'm your host, Payman Asghari, and today we have with us Mr. Dungeons, Deadlifts, and Decarbonization, but we agreed that we would go with D-Cubed. How are you doing, sir?
I'm doing well. Excited to be here.
Likewise. I feel weird saying this, but Mr. D-Cubed, can you tell the audience a little about yourself, please?
Yeah, I guess I started a YouTube channel a little while ago, mostly to kind of start talking about climate change and things like that. And then otherwise, I stream like Baldur's Gate Tuesday nights and let people argue with me. And I had plans to do stuff around weightlifting as well. These are kind of just three topic areas that I'm really interested in. I know they're quite divergent from each other, but I like to, yeah, that was mostly the avenue I went down. And then generally also Canadian politics is something I have a lot of interest in, and kind of the direction that I'm moving with my channel. So.
Okay, D-Cubed, I'm gonna bring up your slides, but I kind of asked you as a favor to the audience to go ahead and describe two concepts for them, sort of as basic as you can. The first one, climate change, how you define it or what it means to you, and then second one, carbon tax, what it means to you.
Yeah, so climate change is just the aggregate of temperature and weather patterns across the globe, and how it changes over time. But broadly, when we're talking about climate change nowadays, it's how the climate has changed since about 1900 until now due to humans. And then in regards to the carbon tax, it's just a way to price in the negative harms of carbon dioxide that it causes to the globe. And yeah, it's just a mechanism usually called an externality. And the tax specifically, if you want to look it up, is Progovian tax.
Sorry, I got distracted there trying to find what to share. Did you
No
go
worries.
over what carbon tax is?
Yeah. So I just
Sorry.
basically said that, yeah, the carbon tax is it's just a mechanism to price in the externality that is carbon into into the market. And sorry, externality being something that the market doesn't otherwise account for. So in this case, we're talking about the economic damage caused by climate change. You're pricing that economic damage in because it isn't otherwise priced into the market. So we do things like that with like the Clean Air Act, trying to get SO2 and NO2 emissions under control. Yeah.
I just one point of clarification. You mentioned carbon. The climate tax, does it target carbon or carbon dioxide?
So yes, I guess it's more specific to say carbon dioxide or carbon dioxide equivalent. So that would be something like methane would be 1 ton of methane is like 25 tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. So things that have a greenhouse effect, but it's primarily carbon dioxide.
Okay, good stuff. Which screen do you see? Do you see the full screen version or the weird one PowerPoint does?
No, it looks full screen. Like I see my name, your name, and then just the whole PowerPoint there.
Okay.
But yeah, this was the slide deck that I used for the first YouTube video I made, which has absolutely terrible audio. And I'm glad to say I've gotten a little bit better at making videos since.
Okay. So what are we looking at here? Why the carbon tax is good in Canada? So what are you gonna present to us today?
Yeah, so this is again, anybody can watch the video to see how it lines up. But basically, this was the video I made because I saw a lot of rhetoric and discussion on the carbon tax, and I didn't think it was accurately describing what it does or why we implement it. So I just wanted to say why I think that the carbon tax is a good thing. And this was before I got banned from the Canada subreddit, because I saw a lot of the comments on that sub, and I wanted to make a response to it. And that's largely what led me to making the channel. I was just like, there seems to be a huge disconnect between the reality of the carbon tax and then what people are saying.
All right, good stuff. Here we go. So I'm going to let you speak to this.
Yeah, so I just wanted to bring this up. Like, this was a 326 upvote comment. And, this person was like, let me kill the pro carbon tax argument. And I disagreed with it heavily. And I kind of used this as kind of the motivation and the starting point for my my slides. We can go through what this person says specifically or get into the more meat of the presentation, whatever you like.
Yeah, let's pad out the show. What is exactly the guy's, what's his beef with the carbon tax here?
Well, I mean, he starts off saying leftists on Canadian subs, and I guess his definition would probably include me as a leftist, though I wouldn't describe myself as such.
Did it automatically go?
Yep, there we go. And saying that axing the tax would make no difference. It definitely would. Like, there's no denying that if you removed a tax, the outcome of that tax would be you would no longer be paying for it, right? But that's a little bit short-sighted when we're talking about carbon dioxide and climate damage and things like that. And it doesn't take into account another important term, which I would, if you aren't familiar, is called a counterfactual. But basically, you can't just compare what you're doing to nothing. You have to compare what you're doing to what the opposite outcome is. So we don't live in a world where climate change isn't happening. So the counterfactual that we have to baseline ourselves off of is like, if climate change didn't happen, where would we be? If climate change gets worse, where are we going? And if we don't have the carbon tax, what happens? And if we do have the carbon tax, what happens? Right? So it'd be like, say we eliminated all taxes in Canada and just be like, see, I'm just like paying less in taxes, but then all of your services go away and all of those other systems would break down. So that's where my issue starts, is this isn't properly taking into account the counterfactual. And then
Apologies.
Otherwise, oh, yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, I thought you were done, but keep going.
Oh, I was going to move on to the next statement, but we can comment on anything that I said if you want me to explain anything more. Or
no, I was just gonna. First of all, I was gonna apologize for my dog in the background, but
no
secondly, I was gonna rephrase what you just said. So when you have taxes, those taxes go to services. You cannot just look at the negative effects of that, which is the taxation. You have to look at the positive effect, which is the services. Correct?
Exactly. And then, yeah, you can't just be like, well, the tax is gone now, so more, right? Like there's push and pull and positives and negatives. Yeah.
Okay, keep going, sir.
And then, yeah, so however stupid the argument, he says, Trudeau wants to increase the tax more, quadruple it by 2030, something that I broadly agree with. And we can get into that later. But yeah, the carbon, I believe when this was before the recent increase, so it was $65 a ton, because this was from January, and it would be increasing to $170 a ton by 2030, I believe. So, and I would broadly say that I'm in favor of a $250 per ton carbon tax, just as a point of reference, based off the literature on the topic. That seems to be the accurate pricing of the damage caused by climate change. So when we're talking about $170 in Canadian, that's probably an undervaluation. But anyway, axing the tax would make a difference. It would save us from the cost increases over the next several years. Again, the counterfactual being, what's the cost of climate damage? What's the cost of the general economic output of the planet decreasing? What's the cost of all of those systems you have to, or all of the carbon that you're not abating, and what temperature we're going to end up at, and how much economic and climate damage that's going to cause? That's the counterfactual. Yeah, so I don't see it as a way of bringing the middle class down into poverty. I see it as a way of adequately accounting for the externality that is climate change. And if you don't believe climate change is real, or don't believe that climate change is causing economic damage or harm to the globe, then it would make sense for you to not be in favor of the carbon tax. But otherwise, the carbon tax seems to be the most efficient and simplest method to price in the economic damage that climate change will cause. Yeah.
So if I can jump in, another way of saying it is the carbon tax is sort of like what it's doing for the environment, what zoning does for properties. So you're preventing future issues. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I would classify it more under like environmental regulations. So I do the example later in the presentation, but it's more the like I can do whatever I want, I just can't hurt anybody else. So like the harm principle. So is your is what you're doing causing harm to other people? Yes or no? If well, actually, that leads really well into the next slide. So we can
Should I
we can
go
probably
ahead?
go to that. Yeah. So this is basically the principle of how the tax works, or and my general principle on the implementation of taxes, or how I like to see them. So we can flick through the slides because it's built as a PowerPoint presentation. But you basically ask the question: does something cause harm? In this case, so does carbon dioxide cause harm? If the answer is no, then you don't have to implement a tax to deal with it. If the answer is yes, then you ask, does the market adequately account for that harm? And then if the answer is yes, then you probably don't need to implement a tax. But if the answer is no, you move on, and then you apply a tax, again, an externality, and that tax gets applied to businesses. Those businesses pass on those costs, and then those costs finally end up at the consumer. Yeah, and then you look at how effective the tax would actually be, and you ask yourself, okay, are there alternatives to what you're doing? And if there aren't alternatives, then the tax will be ineffective. So if we're highly correlated to carbon dioxide in a bunch of ways, and have literally no way of stopping its emissions, then the tax is going to hurt and be a lot more burdensome than if we do have ways to mitigate it. So people who live in cities have a lot more ways, and that's why here in Canada you get more back as part of the carbon rebates. If you live in smaller towns, I believe it's a 20% boost, excluding BC and Quebec because they do their own systems. But on the federal system, you get more back because it's a lot harder to actually abate these emissions. And then again, for the case of alternatives, yes, we have alternatives being renewables from the industry and power side. And then for the individual side, we would have transit, cycling, and I mean, there's heat pumps and a number of other things, but one of the biggest ways is reducing car use. Seems to be a very effective tool, and that behavior is incentivized by the carbon tax because you're incentivized to reduce your carbon emissions, which is the goal of the tax. Yeah. And then the next one, if you go one more, it should just show that at least for the federal system, those taxes are collected and then they're given back on a per capita basis. So that incentivizes you even more. In my case, I live in a city, so and I cycle everywhere. So I end up getting a lot more back on the carbon tax than if I didn't do those things. And then some of the money is cycled back into businesses and things like that.
So first things first, I apologize. I think this PowerPoint has a mind of its own. So if it starts going to the next slide,
oh
I think
no,
it's like on a time delay.
The cadence was pretty close. That was good.
Yeah, I was sweating marbles though, but I was worried I'd go to the next page and have to come back. Do you go over the do you go over the carbon tax in detail later, or should I ask some boneheaded questions now?
No, we can go through Yeah, we can go through it. I can't remember everything. I should have should have looked at the slides a little bit more. But yeah, no worries. It's fun to remember what you did 5 months ago, 6 months ago. So
So the first basic question would be, the carbon tax is federal. Is there also a provincial carbon tax? Damn it.
oh, no worries. Yeah. So basically, my understanding is that the federal government went, "Hey, this is our carbon tax program. You can use this kind of cookie cutter program, or you can develop your own, assuming that it has similar outcomes." And Quebec and BC developed their own. I mean, BC. I'm not as familiar with the Quebec case, but BC has had a carbon tax since I think 2008. So they were well on their way before the federal carbon tax was even implemented.
BC had a carbon tax in 2008. What was it
Yeah.
called and how was it applied?
Uh, I I don't know if they just simply called it a carbon tax, but I believe it started around $10 or $20 per ton, um, and they would recycle the income a little bit. You had to meet certain income thresholds, and you would get some of the carbon tax recycled back. But otherwise, they used it for investment in just the broad category of green technology. And from what we've seen, it seems to be one of the best cases of the carbon tax implementation. It actually reduced per capita emissions in BC by about 15% since its implementation, which is really impressive.
And how is the carbon tax applied? Do they apply it exclusively at the energy level, like power plant production?
So I am a lot more familiar with the federal system. So there could be differences between the BC one and the Quebec one on like the specifics of how it's implemented. But for the federal one, basically what happens is it's applied directly to your like natural gas bill and your fuel at the pump, right? Because we can just calculate the 1 liter of fuel, I believe, is 2.3 kilos of carbon dioxide. Uh, and we can do the same thing with like gigajoules of natural gas. And so that's applied directly and 100%. And then power stations have a lot of like caps, essentially. So you're allowed to emit a certain amount before you start paying. So the effective carbon tax rate is a lot different than the nominal value. So it's usually a ratio about 3 to 1. It is kind of what I've seen in the data. So if the stated carbon tax is $65 a ton, the actual carbon tax, if you average it across all the carbon we emit, is closer to like $20 to $25 a ton because of all of the exemptions that industry gets. So our power systems broadly are mostly exempt from it, whereas like coal plants are like ridiculously exempt. I did in my second video, I kind of go through this a little bit more, but they're paying like $7 a ton or $12 a ton when the actual nominal value is like 65 because of these exemptions.
And then on the other side, you mentioned it comes back to the consumer or to people as subsidies. How does it come back as a subsidy? Is it through the CRA?
Yeah. The CRA, literally, you can look at your CRA account. It'll come just as like a Government of Canada statement on your bank account, and you get those paid out. What is it? Quarterly. So
Should be.
That's if you're on the federal program. You live in BC, from what I know. So a lot of people in BC are like, "What's going on?" Like, I don't have any of this. But if you're in Alberta like me, or anyone that's part of the federal program, then all of that federal revenue is kind of recycled back, and 90% of what they collect comes back at a per capita basis. And I don't know if you're familiar with like left skewed, normal, and right skewed distributions, but carbon dioxide production is heavily, we'll call it right skewed. So people who basically make the most money consume a dramatically disproportionate amount of carbon dioxide. So it means they pay into it the most. And that's why, even though it's given back on like a nominal median rate, the Canadian government or the Liberals will say stuff like, hey, 80% of people get more back than they spend because of how shifted the carbon production skew is, if that makes sense, right? Because it's the difference between
It makes
medians
sense,
and
yeah.
averages, right? So your median and your average is like really far apart in this case.
I just want to make sure we're still recording.
Oh yeah,
I
no
don't want
worries.
to go through it. And all right, so do you should we continue on? Thank you for the answers, by the way.
Yeah, no worries. Yeah, we can head to the next slide.
All right, here we go. So,
So I
what's going
yeah,
on here?
I wanted to do a Peachland example because I was like, okay, like people are talking. Part of the discussion is like, well, these are like you're talking about the direct costs of like of these things, or it's this gets into an issue where like if you don't know, you can kind of map on and make up whatever the answer is. And this is part of what my channel has been about. Is I just like to like look at like scientific studies and then redo the math so that I can have confidence in the outcomes that they're doing, right? And things like that. So I wanted to be like, okay, if we did an example from like California to Vancouver or from Peachland to Vancouver, you can see that there's like basically a 4-to-1 distance ratio. So those carbon taxes are going to get applied differently because you have a further distance to travel. Yeah, I just wanted to do an example of like peaches. Like how much more is the carbon tax going to cost you if you were to buy peaches?
Oh, I thought this was like a road trip, but a road
No.
trip would probably be the same, except
Yeah,
that we
yeah.
don't have carbon tax in the U.S. But
Well, yeah, I'm using it as an example of like distance is going to be proportional to the carbon tax. But yes, also
right,
California does have a carbon tax. So
really?
yeah. I think it's over 30 countries and a couple of states in the United States have carbon taxes. So most of the EU, Mexico, China has a small carbon tax. There's a number of nations across the globe that all have carbon taxes. So
I didn't know that. I thought Canada was a pioneer.
BC probably was in the time that they implemented it, but no, it seems to be taking hold. And then at the end we can talk about places where I think the carbon tax could be improved because I think there's a lot of room for improvement. But anyway. I just wanted to do an example of like how much peaches would cost, predicated essentially on distance.
Very well. Buy locally.
Yeah, you could call the carbon tax a protectionist system if you wanted. So this you can kind of flick through. These are just the assumptions that I was using. NH3 being ammonia or fertilizer, because that has a pretty big carbon footprint. I put all of the costs in USD just because that's typically how cost analyses go. I got comments on my video like, why are you flicking units? And I was like, hey, one, I'm Canadian, so units are basically meaningless. And we use imperial and metric all the time. And so I wanted to compare like California has a much longer growing time to the Okanagan. What's the approximate size of peaches? What's packing, what packing density can we expect? How much CO2 is produced from ammonia? How much fertilizer do you need for a tree? And how much fruit does a tree produce per year, right? Just getting all of the assumptions down. And I think there should be some pop-ups if we go a couple more. So I looked at like, okay, if we had random packing density, so you just threw a bunch of peaches in a truck, long distance trucks kind of have a capacity of about 18,000 to 20,000 kg. So I just used a full payload of 18,000 kg of peaches, assuming 2,000 kg of other stuff. And then so you can calculate it, and you would find out that um, the total kilos of carbon dioxide would be about 294 from just the fuel that you're burning, and then 758 from the ammonia that you need to use. Versus in California, because they have a longer growing season, they don't need to use as much ammonia, but they have to travel a further distance. And anyway, that just shows you on a unit scale how much the carbon tax would increase the price of your peach. So about 0.005 cents or $0.005 per kilo, or half a cent a kilo. And
Sorry,
I have all the math.
I'm getting overwhelmed over here. These things are just popping up on their own.
No worries. This is me just playing with PowerPoint. But yeah, basically the concept was like it would increase the cost of your peaches by less than 0.5%.
Okay, so the argument you're making is that the carbon tax is pretty much negligible.
For certain things. For other things, it's a lot more. So I think in my second video, I talk about mushroom farmers. So mushroom farmers who have to use a whole lot more natural gas in their process are going to pay a lot more. That seems to be an outlier case because just the mechanics of it. This is also a good time to mention that most farm emissions are also exempt. There's like barn drying and a few other things, but broadly speaking, about 90% of all emissions that come from farms are also exempt from the carbon tax. So like things that people talk about, like cow burps and farm equipment and the fuel you need for that farm equipment, none of that is carbon taxed. Yeah.
Let me push back because someone's going to actually ask this. Okay. I had I can't remember the lady's name, but somebody was talking about the energy, like your heating bill at the end of the month, and they said because of the carbon tax, it's gone up like astronomically, or I don't know, 75%, 100%. Is that a different tax, or were they just reading it wrong?
No, I mean it's going to depend on your like on your consumption, but because like here, I'm more familiar with here in Alberta, but like we have a bunch of like extra fees. So we have to look at like what's the actual cost of the carbon tax versus the cost. I'm pretty sure it's in gigajoules. I could be a unit off. But yeah, it's approximately, I would say, doubled that number. Like just it's doubled the number that's on the fuel itself charge, not all of the other auxiliary fees, is what I've seen personally. But you can calculate it, right? You can. It's a direct mathematic comparison. So. Yeah.
All right. Good stuff. Thank you. Should we go to the next slide?
Yeah.
Let's hope this one stays. Go ahead.
Yeah. I mean, this one is literally just the math because I wanted to be as transparent as I could so that people could redo it if they wanted to. Right, so we can move on. Yeah.
Very well.
Yeah, you can see okay, never mind. This did have the Carleton example. So this example came up in the House of Commons where Pierre was talking about this guy's farm. So I took the costs that he said he had. He said he approximately had an operating cost of about $100,000 per year. If we go to the next one, and he said that November his gas bill was 72,000 Canadian, with 16,000 of that coming from the carbon tax. So you can see the proportionality. In this case, this was at $65 a ton. You would add an extra few percent at the 80% now. So that's approximately 10% of the OPEX. And OPEX being operating cost. Yeah.
All right. Yeah. Well, I never got my degree as an accountant, so walk me through
Okay.
this.
Okay.
This farmer, the gentleman is saying that this year his operating costs have gone up by 100,000.
Yes. So he said over the course of the year, his operating costs went up by $100,000 per year, which again, this can be like a little bit frustrating because I'm an engineer. I work in industry. I work with a lot of like $1 million, $1 billion like numbers. So when we start to get into like large scale operations, $100,000 for you or me is a lot. But when we're talking about these operations, we have to put it into context of like percentages. So he said that his operating costs increased by about $100,000 in the year. And so overall, his natural gas OPEX was 10%. I was able to kind of back calculate what the total operating cost was to $560,000 per year. And then using that information, we're able to see how much the carbon tax increases the per kilo cost. Because again, we kind of bury the lead when we're just like, because Pierre was in the House of Commons being like, it costs an extra $100,000 a year, which sounds really bad. But then when you go, it's like, okay, this was a 3% increase, which is still a lot. And I'm not denying that like the price of food and like all of these things go up, but it's a lot less impactful when you're like, the price per kilo of mushrooms went up 30 cents versus his operating cost went up by $100,000 a year, right? Even though saying it went up by 30 cents is a more accurate description. And then if we take into account that we get 90% of the carbon taxes back, its effective rate is only about 3 cents a kilo, right? So
if I understand this correctly, Pierre Poilievre, or the comment that was made was a misleading comment.
yeah.
So it was $16,000 coming from the carbon tax, and the additional, whatever, 84,000 was probably due to inflation or market costs?
No, sorry. He's just saying that his November bill. Sorry, it's been a while since I've seen these slides. So, sorry. Yeah. So his November bill was $72,000, right? And he said $16,000 of that 72,000 was the carbon tax, and then he said overall his operating costs increased by 100,000 that year, because obviously he's gonna like his heating bill is going to be different depending on the month. November is going to be a particularly bad month, so if we kind of just take the aggregate of the year, operating costs increased by $100,000 a year, and go from there.
Sorry. Okay, I
Yeah.
understand. So the carbon tax for him was $100,000 a year.
Yeah, that seemed to be what he was implying. Yeah.
Okay, so it wasn't I guess it wasn't a misleading comment, but what you're saying is, yet a lot,
Well,
90,000 of that came back to him.
Yeah, 100,000 is kind of a meaningless number if we don't have the context of what the unit cost is and what the total revenues of the company are, and like this wouldn't be the case. But if he was $1 billion mushroom company, then $100,000 increase at a unit rate is going to be relatively small, right? So, and again, the point of the carbon tax is that you pass this on to the consumer, and then the consumers can make choices and decisions for themselves on these items, and then he can make choices and decisions to be like, okay, can I move to a hydrogen heating system? Can I move to a more efficient system? Can I put a carbon capture system on this? Can I do all of these myriad of options? And again, this kind of gets into that place where it's like, well, are those options available? Are they economic? Are they all of these things? And by having a consistent long-term goal of what the carbon tax is going to be, we're able to like companies and firms are able to make these economic decisions and price the increasing price of carbon into their decision-making process. And that's why it's such a beautiful system, because the government basically doesn't have to do anything, right? it's as hands-off as the government can be for something like this, which is why I dislike Poilievre's plan.
The viewers are going to lose all respect for me by the end of this episode. But if I understand this correctly, the gentleman is saying that carbon tax. So he's saying it cost me 100,000 this year. You're saying yes, but that only comes out to 3 cents per kilogram increase for the mushrooms.
When you include the rebates, if you don't include the rebates, then it's about 3 cents a kilo. or
but
sorry,
with the
30,
rebates,
30,
it's
30 cents.
30
Yeah,
cents.
because
Okay.
the rebates come back at 90% on a per capita basis. So when you look at the effective cost to like the broad consumer over the year, it's going to be about 3 cents a kilo. Yeah.
All right. Good times.
Yeah, you could put if feel free to push back on me harder and like ask harder questions. I don't mind a little bit of strife. I don't mind a little bit of like kind of, you know, I know that's not necessarily your style, but I'm more than happy to not necessarily be combative, but like you can push me harder and disagree with me, and yeah.
No. I just I was trying to get my wrap my head around these
Yeah,
numbers.
we can go to the next slide that has like
All right.
all the math on it. Again, this ends up being a little bit math heavy. But yeah. So yeah, this is basically showing that like in that month, his total cost was $72,000. The carbon tax was $16,000 of that. So if he didn't have a carbon tax, it would have been $56,000. Right.
Right. Okay, I see it.
And then I said, and then he said his heating OpEx was about 10% of his operating cost. So you just divide 56,000 by 10%, and that gives you the OpEx without a carbon tax, right? So,
Okay, I follow.
yeah.
Next slide.
Yeah. And then I looked up online, mushrooms are about $10 a kilo. So that's why I use that as the unit basis, because that's about what you would buy them in. I think actually generally less, but doing dollars per kilo is an easier metric. Anyway,
I'm not a big fan of mushrooms, but don't let that interrupt your presentation.
And then I just wanted to align this with like, okay, what are kind of economists saying? What are they saying the actual cost is? And it generally is in between the kind of two estimates I had, because like peaches and fruits and vegetables like that that are more seasonal growing are going to have really low carbon tax emissions on it. Again, my second video, I think, does a little bit better job of that, because you can look at what's called life cycle emissions. So that just like normalizes and says, this is the total emissions of whatever good or service it is. But generally, the economists found that it was about 30 cents per $100, or 0.3% is what the carbon tax is currently increasing our costs on. And that, again, includes all of these like indirect factors and effects, and what are the miscellaneous power costs, and what are the fuel costs, and what are all these things. And like I said, you can calculate a lot of this yourself by just looking at life cycle emissions. So if you look at the life cycle emissions of apples, it's basically negligible in terms of carbon taxes. But if you looked at the life cycle emissions of cattle, it's like, if we actually paid for the full carbon tax of cattle, it would be like $6 to $7 per kilo. But really, we're paying way less than that. We're paying maybe 60 cents or less because of all the exemptions that farms get. So, yeah.
Can you? I have two questions here, but first of all, the exemptions that the farms get, how exactly do the exemptions work out? Do they have like a cap that they don't get taxed up until then?
So for a number of industries, that's what it is you can release a certain amount of CO2, and then after that point, you start paying the marginal tax rate. Or in the case of farms, it would be like, you know how you can buy like boat fuel and it's like taxed differently? That's essentially what this is when the farmers buy fuel for their equipment, that carbon tax that's normally applied isn't applied.
What about fertilizer, things like that? Is that taxed?
To my knowledge, that's also isn't taxed. There's like 4 things. It's what is it? It's like barn heating and like hay drying, and there's 4 or 5 things that they list. I can't remember all of them off the top of my head. So I guess the argument against this would have been like, I probably shouldn't have included ammonia in my analysis, but then it would have been even lower, like even more negligible. I just wanted to show it like as an extra item. But yeah.
And my other question was, what is the root cause of the? So you hear it in Parliament, and both sides do this, but the NDP is crying out for price gouging grocery store CEOs. Is this price gouging inflation? What's driving the cost of food prices if it's not carbon tax?
Like that's probably not
In
something that
your
I
in your not
yeah,
expert
yeah,
opinion,
yeah.
but
It's just my non-expert opinion. Look, I think if you have a large group of people who are convinced that the carbon tax is causing food prices to inflate, and we have what is effectively an oligopoly of these food brands, then if they think that they can get away with it, I wouldn't put it past them to increase prices with that at least perception, because they're capital firms after all, like fundamentally. But it seems that like food price increases are probably more due to like supply chain constraints and issues that we still felt from COVID. And there's probably some level of like price gouging that exists. I'm like not going to deny there is, but I don't think that I'm informed enough on kind of the market structure of grocery stores. I can just do life cycle analyses and estimate what the carbon tax physical costs are, and just say that that's certainly not what's increasing the cost. I believe Tomby, who did his analysis, found it to be a lot of it came from energy volatility. So not the carbon tax energy volatility, but specifically just like gas prices going up and down. Like the Ukraine war obviously exacerbated those prices across the globe. So things like that have far greater impacts on living costs.
all right. Shall we move on?
Yeah.
What do we got here?
Okay. So yeah, this was just me trying to start like engaging with some of the comments that I was seeing that were getting, some more upvotes. So, this is a common argument that we see is like Canada could literally be net zero emissions and that would change nothing unless India, USA, China change, and they never will. So why are we being punished? And that seems to be, I think that captured a broad sentiment that I see and I feel. I don't know if you felt that when people talk about this or think of it, but this kind of encapsulated what it seems to me. And these were some of the kind of, I'm just putting together kind of the arguments that I was seeing. So if we go to the next one, because I answered them in the next slides, this part of it's just part of a natural cycle. So, if you're saying humans didn't exist, this was on a different subreddit, but you can see the downvotes. But it's still kind of a sentiment that I see often is, so you're saying that if humans didn't exist or never existed, that the climate would not change. That's not what I'm saying. And we'll get to that. And then have you considered that climate is a natural part of the world, maybe a million-year cycle? I don't know. So, those are natural cycle arguments. And then the last one is basically Canada has trees, so people should be paying us.
I think there's another one. There we go.
Oh yeah, there's one more. And then, this one was a little. This one he said to me, I don't know. I don't want to get you demonetized or anything, so I might not say what he's saying out loud. But
No, go ahead.
Oh, he says, if you think carbon is an existential crisis, why don't you just kill yourself? By your logic, you'd be saving the planet. Heck, why stop at one? Why don't all the leftist pro-carbon taxers get a giant Kool-Aid drinking party and they mass suicide so the rest of humanity has a chance to survive? It's for the greater good. Any takers? Probably not. Yeah, I thought I find that stuff funny when people say it to me, but not everybody has the same sense of humor. I find that also interesting because I don't want to. I guess I should be clear that like I care about economic prosperity as like the final goal. And the reason that I'm pro the carbon tax is because I think it benefits us long term for economic prosperity. Um, yeah, and yeah, I want that to be benefited by everybody. Anyway, we can move on, and I answer some of these.
I got some questions. Um,
Yep.
I want to reframe or recapture what the purpose of the carbon tax is.
Yep.
Is the purpose of the carbon tax to reduce CO2 emissions? Is the purpose to bring in green energy? Is the purpose wealth redistribution from the polluters to the non-polluters? Like, what is it? I'm guessing it's a combination of all three, but like, what is it in order?
Yeah. Well, I'd say that the main goal would be to reduce carbon emissions, and what you do with that money that comes in is going to. So it does two things, right? It's going to send a price signal to you or I or anybody buying things that high carbon things are going to cost more than they used to. So you can make different decisions as a consumer, right? So that's like front and center. And then it goes, okay, now that we've collected these taxes, what do we do with it? So you can have kind of a unit. You can think of it as like, where does that money best get spent, right? And on the other side, and that this is, we can get into this later, of like, how is a carbon tax best implemented, and where I see some of the problems from like a purist perspective, but also understand it from like a governmental perspective, in that from a government perspective, recycling most of that money back into the economy is probably the most politically feasible way of implementing the carbon tax, because it's the least painful, but it's probably also one of the least effective ways of actually getting to your end result. It's going to slow down the overall process, right? Because you're going to get way more benefit if you took that bundle of money and invested it in solar panels or transmission infrastructure or wind farms, right? Just by definition, because then you give more of those options, like I talked about, so that people can get power from these systems and move away from the high carbon systems.
You kind of lost me there. So can I ask a follow-up question?
Sure.
You said, I believe what you said was taking the money and returning it to the consumer is not the most, damn it, stop it. It's not the most efficient way. The efficient way would be to invest it in green energy.
Yep.
I'm paraphrasing.
If your goal is reduction of CO2 emissions, right? But if you want to make it politically viable, then I understand recycling it back into the economy, because voters are the people that you have to also appease, right?
I agree, I get that, but where you lost me was, I thought they're already doing that, where they're taking some of the carbon tax and giving it back to people that have like solar panels and wind farms.
So 90% of the taxes that they get, they recycle back to just people on a per capita basis that are in the federal program. And then 10% goes into those other systems. At least that's the goal. There's like a big holdup with it. And again, we can say that was like a mismanagement by the Liberal government and a fuck up on their part. Or, sorry, oh shit. I was trying not to swear. On their part, and like a mismanagement of the system. Their fuel oil exemption was a mismanagement on their system. Like I can like list off all the problems that I have with how the Liberals have actually implemented it, what they've done, etc. I'm more talking about the carbon tax as a concept, and that I still think that it's good in Canada. I just think there's a lot of room for improvement.
Yeah. Fair enough. And just again, to recapture what you said, right now it's 10%. And you're saying the most efficient way, if you're trying to reduce CO2, would be 100%.
Yeah.
Is that accurate?
I mean, so we get into like levels of political feasibility, right? So the most politically feasible is going to be recycling it to the people. And then one step below that would to be invest in green energy within your country, or infrastructure projects like rapid transit, like a bullet train from Montreal to Windsor, right? Things like that would have like big, valuable impact on reducing CO2 emissions. But then you also go, well, it doesn't matter where each each unit of CO2 is emitted. So if you invest that money in poorer nations where you can build more relative to the reduction in CO2 that you get, you would get a broader CO2 reduction. But that is completely politically unfeasible because you're taking jobs out of Canada, you're taking money out of Canada more than it already is, and just the amount of political turmoil that would cause, even though it would probably have the best unit reduction on CO2 emissions if that's your narrow focus on the system, right?
All right, thank you.
Yeah.
Moving on.
Yep.
You're going to be your worst enemy by the end of this because you're going to be my worst enemy. These damn slides, they have a mind of their own.
I'm sorry. Yeah, so the tax won't work. The argument that I make is like, would you make this argument if selenium from a coal? I don't know if you're familiar with selenium. It's technically a vitamin that most people take. There's a lot of selenium in Brazil nuts, and it's really good for you. But in really high doses, selenium is really bad for you. Like a lot of things, right? There's like a happy medium, and selenium in high doses causes like birth defects in fish and a bunch of like negative health consequences in humans. So you would largely say that like you wouldn't want selenium runoff from a coal mine affecting your water source. And if we implement taxes, quote unquote, for selenium in Canada, just because the United States or China isn't implementing those and allowing those coal mines, for instance, to be putting selenium into your water, you would still say, hey, that's probably not a good thing and not something that we want. But that, again, doesn't really track regardless because China does have a carbon tax. The EU has carbon taxes. The EU is implementing what's called a border adjustment carbon tax. So basically, they adjust if you're importing goods from a nation that doesn't have carbon taxes, they're just going to adjust the cost of those goods so that it reflects the entrained carbon in those goods to align it with the carbon tax they have in that nation. So again, that's when I talk about it as you could look at it as almost a protectionist system, is that if you implement carbon border taxes, then goods from further away are going to be at a disadvantage from goods closer to home. So, and again, I would call the tax libertarian. This question got me banned on the libertarian sub. So you can see I'm up to 2 subs I've been banned from because of the carbon tax. They don't like the word tax in the libertarian subreddit. You can call it whatever you want. But basically, if you're imposing some sort of regulation to deal with the externality that is whatever it is, that's effectively a tax, and that works within a libertarian framework that cares about the harm principle, in that I can do whatever I want. I just can't hurt other people, either physically or economically. So that's why I consider the tax to be libertarian in nature. I'm going to get a lot of hate for that position, and I will die on that hill.
It's okay. Nobody takes the libertarians seriously anymore.
Yeah,
so it should be fine.
And just generally, like, there's obviously positives to what we're doing. One of the most important things, this position that I have would be a lot harder to argue for if renewable energy wasn't so economically viable right now. But because it is the best economic choice in a lot of cases, it's really easy to argue. That's why we're seeing Texas, who people would consider a red state, build so much renewable energy, so much solar, so much wind, so much battery production, just because they have lighter regulations that allows them to build these rapidly, and kind of against what you would expect the broader populace to believe or like. If we draw really distinct lines of like, conservatives don't like renewable energy, liberals do, blah, blah, At the end of the day, economics don't really care. Uh, so it's a lot easier for me to argue this because it can be a driver for positive economic growth. And then other things like Canada leads the world in nuclear material, and we have abundant EV resources, so it can expand our mineral resource industry in terms of like mining cobalt and lithium and nickel and copper. Like we have huge abundant resources of this, and the States is making a big push for renewable energy and consider Canada part of that plan. And that means a lot more mining industry here in Canada. So it's not some zero-sum game where we implement the tax and only bad things happen. You also have to take into account that renewable jobs generally create more jobs than fossil fuels, mostly because it's a bit of a newer industry. A lot of it is like infrastructure based. So like a lot of those jobs are temporary in a sense, but they provide a lot of work for people as well. So it's a balance.
All right,
Yeah.
question time.
Yeah.
Nuclear energy, is that renewable or non-renewable?
You would generally consider it non-renewable because you are like mining a physical resource and using that resource as a fuel. Renewables generally are considered functions of more I guess it would be solar scale. You could call the sun non-renewable, but for all practical purposes, it's renewable, right? And that seems to be the main distinction, but I'm happy to include nuclear in the broad scope of it. With that said, I'm going to be having a debate in a month on why I don't think a nuclear is a viable option, and that's mostly predicated on cost. So I like nuclear as a system. I think we should keep old nuclear systems running as long as possible. But new nuclear systems, even in pro-nuclear places like South Korea and China, are still having a hell of a time being cost competitive with renewables. And yeah.
That's what I was going to ask. The cost of nuclear being high, how much of it is because of it just is? How much of it is because of regulations? Yeah, that was my question.
Yeah. So my next video, I'm going to be delving into this. But even if you give it a 3 times reduction in its costs, so taking it from about $15,000 a kilowatt down to $5,000 a kilowatt, which is kind of best case scenario anybody thinks nuclear will be by 2035, it still can't compete with renewable energy. And from what I've been able to read and find, like regulations do play a part and a role. And a big part of that is like padding out the timing required to actually build it. But once you like get boots on the ground and start developing the site so that you can build it, it looks like regulations are probably 30 to 50% of those costs. But again, even if you apply that to, and then the rest of it is like soft costs and like increases in steel costs and like all of these things. Again, once you pull out the regulation piece, it still isn't economic, and it still would probably take billions of dollars to potentially even get it close to economically viable compared to renewable energies. Because they've just, like, solar lends itself to economies of scale so well. It's like 4 components, right? You put it on an assembly line, it's like a square. It like solar has had an insane reduction in cost because it is just so perfect for assembly lines, right? Like, yeah.
Another question I have to ask, because anybody that disagrees with you in the comments are just going to blow it up. What
Yeah.
about this argument that I'm not an engineer? I don't even
Sure.
claim to know this stuff, but like the toxicity of these solar panels vis-a-vis recycling them, and what's the big argument? Lithium mining for batteries, things like that. How does that factor into this?
Yeah, I think those are legitimate concerns to have. Like, mining is going to be a function of the regulations and institutions you have within the country that's doing the mining for the most part. Um, so yeah, I mean, you can have mining that's really bad. That's largely why we're trying to move away from cobalt, because most of the cobalt is in the Congo and mined through less than ideal means. But things like lithium, there's two basic mines for lithium. There's spodumene mines, which are like more conventional mines, ones that you wouldn't really consider bad or any worse than any other kind of mining. And then you have basically what are salt flats. So they're just big, huge, like plains of lithium. And the biggest one in the world was just found in Nevada, which has a strong mining industry and would be able to provide a lot of that resources. A lot of the nickel can come from Canada. And when we're talking about lithium ion batteries, they're actually going to be kind of on their way out for when we're talking from the power system perspective. Because it looks like we're going to start moving into iron air batteries, LFP batteries, and sodium ion batteries because they're a lot cheaper. Their minerals are a lot more abundant. Like iron air, for instance, is literally just like an iron oxide reaction. Lithium ion sodium ion replaces the lithium component, and it also replaces like the cobalt and stuff. You can use something called Prussian blue or Prussian white for that system. And then LFP batteries are lithium iron, so that again gets rid of the cobalt and some of the other systems. So for storage batteries and batteries for the power grids and systems that we have, it looks like lithium ion probably won't be the main battery system in the next 5 to 10 years here.
Well, that mostly went over my head, but thank you.
No, sorry. I love this stuff, so I get a little bit overzealous. But yes, there is mining concerns, but it's a comparison of like terrestrial waste versus like aerosol waste or like water-based waste. And the other thing is the reason that we don't recycle panels and things to the degree we would expect is because we simply don't have the mass for it. Right? So your recycling facilities are going to be predicated on how much basically raw material you have to recycle. But we actually haven't installed that much solar and wind, and the lifespans of these farms are 20, 30 years. So you need to kind of wait for those farms to retire. So the little bit of waste that we do have is building up, but you can think of those as more like short-term 30 to 40 year stockpiles that we will reprocess because it's filled with like very valuable minerals. So the expected recycling industry is going to be huge in the next 10-ish years. We just don't have the mass for it.
Got it. Last question before moving on. You mentioned externality. Can you explain for the audience what an externality is?
Yeah, it's basically just something that's not accounted for in our market systems. I think markets are great. I think the free market is amazing, but it doesn't always account for things outside of it. And you need to price those things in, essentially. It's probably better for me to give you like a textbook definition, but if you prefer. But yeah, an externality is just something that the market isn't considering.
Like, what's an example of an externality?
Carbon taxes are usually the best example given, but like I said at the beginning, like selenium or any regulations on like effluent waste would be that as well. Basically, like think of it in the like, if you didn't have any regulations, what would the company do? Well, a company like a coal mine would just dump selenium into your water, and then you would have to drink that water. And then you price in those externalities through like regulations or carbon tax mechanics or things like that. Or you could even, sorry, I just hit my mic. Hopefully that doesn't pop up. But sin taxes would also be part of that. So it's like the externality of like the harms caused by alcohol, you can price in by adding an alcohol tax.
So if I do, what's a narcotic? If I drop acid and I start acting like a lunatic and I start scaring all the the women with their kids in the park. That would be an externality of the acid.
um, yeah. You could probably call that like a social harm of that, and that. Yeah. Again, we kind of get into like the economics world of like you can eventually reduce everything to money at some point. This idea that everything has a cost, but it's usually a bit more big picture than that. Of like, like the simplest one would be like how much does alcohol strain our healthcare system, and how much alcohol is consumed per year. And then you take that number, that value number of how much it strains your healthcare system, and divide it by the volume number, and then apply that on a volume basis. That is probably the easiest way to think of it. That's not exactly how it's done, obviously, but that's probably the simplest way to think of it.
Okay, so if I go back to that, if people are just in record numbers doing acid, they're going in the park, they're assaulting other people, and it ends up in the courts, that cost of 100 times more people going to the court system, that's an externality?
I guess I've never heard it put that way, but probably not a good place to apply the externality. That probably, if it's that bad, you would probably just want to have stronger regulations on it. Right. So like part of this could just be straight up banning things, right? So like we ban CFCs, right? So instead of even pricing in the externality, we just said CFCs are destroying the ozone layer. Figure out a solution, right? And ban them, right? So, yeah.
Got it. Wow, we got another slide.
Oh yeah.
Oh, we got many slides. Okay.
Don't worry.
This one seems to play nice, but
yeah,
hopefully
there should be something that comes on top of it. This gets into the natural cycle arguments. It really depends on your scale. Has climate changes? Climate's always changed. At a geological scale, yes. From a human scale, not really. When we look at the last 800,000 years, the amount of CO2 has been consistent between 170 to 300 ppm. Anything below 200 ppm, generally plant life dies. So 300 ppm being the place probably where we would want CO2 levels to be. That's what most of our crops and things evolve to exploit. And our overall global climate chart shows significant changes over time, but those are really long periods of time. And the best climate for our crops, our animals, and our planet really is what they've adapted to over kind of the last million years, which is not the CO2 levels that we're currently seeing today. Generally, ecological systems don't like rapid changes. And yeah, that's the chart. I mean, you've probably seen it before. Yeah, like we can talk about it. I know this chart generally has a lot of contention for anybody who doesn't agree with the assertion that climate change is real. Yeah.
I have a question. Hydrocarbons, oil. There's this perception among the ordinary people that oil, dinosaurs, damn it, stop doing that. Dinosaurs died and then they turned into oil and we're going to run out. Is oil a limited resource or is it continuously being replenished?
That's a good question. I'm not like a geological engineer. My understanding would be that in probably a really, really long timescale sense, it would be somewhat replenishable. But my understanding is that most of the coal, most of the oil and stuff formed at specific times in the Earth's history that had the best conditions for it. and that we broadly would run out. But a lot of the time when we're talking about reserves and resources for these things, we're talking about economic reserves and resources. So like if we say, hey, like we're going to run out of oil in 30 years, or we're going to run out of copper in 30 years, we're going to run out of economically viable copper right now. And so if the price increases, then you get more economically viable copper and that resource estimate increases.
Got
So
it.
yeah,
It's not the
that's
available resources they're talking about.
yeah, it's something like our copper mines are like 0.3% copper for the most part, but our Earth's crust is like 0.007% copper. So like if you're willing to pay enough, we can spend the enormous amounts of energy, time, and resources to get that copper if we really need it, right? Like, but that, yeah, like, so we're, for the most part, we have enough like terrestrial ore to do anything that we want. It just depends how much we're willing to pay for it.
What was my next question? Where is the most of the carbon or CO2? It's not in the air. It's in the water, or is it in the earth? Where is it?
Uh, well, generally, like when we're talking about like the effect of like carbon dioxide, we're talking about the atmospheric carbon dioxide, but about 50% of the carbon dioxide that we release gets absorbed by the oceans and then acidifies them.
What was that last word you used? Acidifies?
Acidifies it, right? Because it's the same reason that like um, Coke or anything will rot your teeth. It's because carbon dioxide, when dissolved in water, creates carbonic acid, and
Okay.
that causes ocean acidification.
Where was I reading? Like the majority is at the bottom of the ocean, though, right? Like it's in solid form, or am I wrong?
I'm not. Uh, I don't know about that. Again, most of what I care about is the atmospheric
Okay.
piece, but yeah,
No, no, no. The reason I
I'm
asked,
not sure.
I read it somewhere, and it's like I was just trying to get a sense for the purpose of like the audience.
Mm-hmm.
Um, where is our CO2 coming from? But I guess the easy answer is it comes from oil.
Yeah. So yeah, like this gets into the like, how do we know humans are causing climate change? We can do carbon isotope matching, and then we can also just look at the exajoules of energy that humans have produced since 1900 and correlate that to how much CO2 one exajoule of coal will produce or one exajoule of natural gas. And based off those proportions, which we have pretty good understandings of, you can calculate how much physical CO2 went into the atmosphere and then divide that by the volume. And you would get about double the CO2 concentration that we have, or double the CO2 concentration from humans, at least in the atmospheric perspective. And then but we know that half of it goes into the ocean. And then you can roughly estimate 420 ppm from the starting point of about 280 ppm. And you can literally just do the math on it.
What? For my curiosity, what happens? Damn it! I swear to God, I'm going to kill these slides. What happens if? What are we at? What happens if we get to 1,000 ppm, 10,000 ppm? Is it going to turn into like a Hollywood movie, or I'm just curious.
So, like, I'm not gonna sit here and say this like climber doomerism. Broadly speaking, we will see slow changes over time of temperatures increasing. From what I understand, I think like the worst predictions I see is like 700 to 1,000 ppm. Would kind of be the end range after like quite a long time. It really depends on like what scenario we go down. But you're going to see a gradual change in temperature over time, and that's going to cause different levels of economic damage, and the economic damage is not linearly proportional, but more superlinearly or exponentially proportional to the temperature. So where at 1.5 degrees, we're looking at like a GDP loss globally of like 3 to 4%. A doubling of that to a temperature of 3 degrees, we're looking at 10%, possibly upwards of 15%. right? So it doesn't scale linearly, it scales super linearly. So that's why anything that we do now has a larger impact than things we could do later. Yeah.
You beat me to it. I was going to tie your initial premise to this, where you said basically your entire premise is an ounce of planning prevents a ton of grief. So if we
Yeah.
do the carbon tax now, we don't have to pay for it. Our children don't have to pay for it later.
Yeah, exactly. And I think you could certainly argue that whatever price we're paying now is probably more than the current damage. But again, you have to look at it on a bit longer of a scale, where it's like, okay, what's the overall kind of economic damage that we're predicting would happen, and then you have to balance it against those counterfactuals. And again, because renewables are so cheap now, it actually makes a lot of economic sense to do this. There's a really good chart that shows that, like, I think we can get about a 50% reduction in CO2 emissions with like a zero carbon tax, just by the economic value of doing these things. And then,
Okay.
yeah,
I have to ask you another devil's advocate question.
sure.
The audience will ask, if renewables are cheaper, why do we need a carbon tax incentive?
To get past that other kind of 50%. So renewables being cheaper is, I guess I would think of it as like delta. So are you familiar with like diffusion? Basically, if you have a lot of concentration on one side and no concentration on the other, you're going to have a lot of that object trying to move to the area of low concentration. So think of like dye. If you drop dye in water, right, you have really high concentration that spreads out. But then as it spreads out, as the concentration gets lower and lower, the rate that it spreads out is slower and slower. So if you make the delta between fossil fuels and renewables even larger through things like carbon taxes, through things like subsidies, then the rate at which you uptake them is even higher. And then past that is, if you want to get past, like I said, that 50% number, there's other things that we need to decarbonize that are a lot harder, much, much harder, like steel manufacturing and cement and transportation and shipping and even our grid infrastructure. Like as much as the renewables themselves, solar and wind, and now batteries are pretty much there, or at least batteries in the next 3 to 5 years will like certainly be there. You still need a lot of this other auxiliary stuff. So like I said, you get about 50% without a carbon tax, but the rate at which you get to that 50% can be increased by having a carbon tax.
So speed it along.
Yeah. And
All right.
that's kind of tangential and like separate from the carbon still causes harm, and we should price in that externality, right?
Carbon still causes harm, and factor in
Right,
the
because
externality.
carbon causes economic harm. So adding the carbon tax prices in that economic harm, regardless of how efficient renewables are.
Okay.
Yeah.
Can we finally go to the next slide without these slides causing me a mental breakdown?
I'm sorry.
That's okay. I'm just teasing. Go ahead.
Yeah. I think if you do one more, it'll come up with the other chart. Because the cadence of me speaking about this. So this is just millions of years. You can see that CO2 emissions had been up at 2000, depending on what case we're looking at. Yeah, you can see the worst case is the 8.5 degrees is 2000 ppm. But like I said, most cases are below 1000. And generally, like my understanding is that like as much as those times in history were really green and really lush and jungly, that's not really the best conditions for farms, for global food production. And also it was jungly in basically Canada and Argentina, and the rest of the world was broadly uninhabitable. If you look at some of the imagery from or expected imagery from those times. So that's why I push back on people saying, well, the earth is getting greener. Well, I don't care if it's getting greener. I care if our crops are growing.
And your argument is if it gets too hot, it's It's difficult to grow food, or
It's more difficult. So I did a video on this as well, but basically, the more 30 Celsius days you have, kind of the less crop yields you get. So if the Earth is getting hotter, then you're getting more plus 30 days, and that's causing you to have weaker crop yields, which means you have to mitigate those issues with more fertilizer, which costs you more money, and that cycle kind of goes on and on and on. And that's going to hurt the poorest people in the world because they're the ones who are getting the most impacts from climate change, because between the tropics is where the outcomes are the worst. And even though most of the aggregate CO2 emissions came from the global north, as it were, and they have the least resilience to those price fluctuations. But even for us, it again just increases costs of things. Wetter places get wetter, which means you'll see more floods in those places. Drier places get drier, so you see more wildfires and more droughts and things like that. So,
all right. I don't. I'm just overwhelmed by all these dots and lines. I don't really have any follow up questions.
That's all good.
I don't know.
Yeah,
I could ask you a sci-fi question.
Yeah. This is just showing like a billion years or whatever. So,
could we ever end up like Venus? Where we get a runoff CO2 event?
I mean, possibly, but I don't think it would happen. Like, again, all of the carbon that we're currently releasing, at some point, like we see, like in the RCP 8.5, would have existed at some point. It's just those aren't conditions that humans evolved to, or the crops that we have evolved to, or the ecological environment we have evolved to. And like I said, things do not like rapid changes. Like ecological systems don't like rapid changes. So, yeah.
Fair enough. We have a very sensitive environmental system. Next slide.
Yes.
What's going on here?
Okay, this is trees. This is a funny argument, and with Canadians, but basically they're like, we have lots of trees. Just if you go to the next slide, you'll see that's not exactly true. So if the lines are in the negative, that means they're carbon sinks, and if they're in the positive, that means they are carbon emitters. And guess what causes a lot of our carbon emissions in forests? Disturbance from insects, which you're from BC, so me and you are pretty intimately familiar with pine beetle, which is in part a cause because of climate change, because they aren't dying in the cold as much. So this is one of those positive feedback loops that scientists will often talk about, on how it gets warmer, and then these bugs live longer, and then they kill more trees, and then those trees cause more CO2 emissions. So, yeah, it's actually not forestry or burning or any of those things. It's those damn insects. But our forests generally wouldn't be considered carbon sinks. And then these are just my references. So, yeah.
I'm trying to come up with some interesting questions to ask, but I grew up in Vancouver, so we don't really have trees. We have concrete. So basically what this graph is showing is that in the years 2008 to 2014, trees died, and either they got burned or they just decomposed.
So this is just showing the overall CO2 emissions. That is caused by forests. And then you see the forest disturbances in hectares as the bar chart. So you can see that basically, like right after 2001, forests have been net producers of CO2 consistently. And then before 2001, they were sinks in Canada.
Oh, I see. So less is better.
Yes, less is better. Yes.
Okay, yeah, it was misleading. I'm like, why were there no trees in 1990 to
Oh,
2000?
no. That's basically areas that are disturbed. Yeah, and would contribute. Yeah.
So what
So
happened in 2008 to 2013?
2008 to 2013. It
What
looks like
happened?
it was. I'm not 100% sure about there. This is just again the aggregation of data. So you get fluctuations and in the results over time, but it's more kind of about the aggregate over time. I would have
All
to go
right.
back to the study. The study's linked, but I don't remember what it says specifically.
I'm trying to think. I think we said we would talk about immigration as well, but this is, if it's all right, I'd like to bring you back to do that. It's been a,
Yeah,
I guess,
100%. I mean, yeah, it's been an hour and a half, so
yeah.
I'm always happy to talk about these things. And yeah, like I said, so
Wait, let me see. Do I have any questions? Here's one. What if somebody says the carbon tax disproportionately affects some people as opposed to others, like people living in rural areas, they have to drive like 20 kilometers to get a grocery store.
yeah, I would argue that's true. I would argue it's mitigated to some degree. Like I said, so I get less per capita back, and more is given to rural people. So like, let's say my per capita rate was like $1,000 a year. Someone in a rural area would be like 1,200. So they get a 20% boost compared to me. And I think there's probably some calibration on how to best allocate that. But I think, at least in my personal case, I think people in cities should probably get a lot less. And I would be more than happy if my rebate went to like 500 and people in rural areas went up to like 1,700 to help mitigate those costs and concerns. And that gets into the how could this be better implemented arguments.
And
But yeah.
one final question. What advice would you have for Canada policy wise to have a better, cleaner future? I mean, let's put this aside, like conservationism, environmentalism. Do you have any suggestions?
Yeah, it would broadly be. I'd like to see a level of deregulation. What Daniel Smith did in Alberta, I think, is really dumb and anti-capitalist and just quite stupid. We could be like Texas, kind of building out these power systems and ramping up production and doing all these things. And she put in really silly policies that basically hamstrung projects that were about to get started. And yeah, that's it's stuff like that. And then probably better transmission interconnection systems. So working with the provinces to get transmission interconnection, because that is the main thing that deals with intermittency. So when the wind isn't blowing in Alberta, it almost certainly is in Ontario, and that's what we saw in January when we had that those down days. Ontario actually had really good wind generation, and if we had better transmission infrastructure, we could have sent power from Ontario all the way here effectively. The concept is called a copper plate, but it's pretty much the most important thing to renewable energy. And so, yeah, I would say large scale transmission infrastructure projects.
Very well. Mr. D Cubed, I'm still
Yeah.
getting used to that. Can you tell the audience where they can go to follow you, to see other work you've done?
Yeah, so my YouTube channel is Dungeons, Deadlifts, and Decarbonization. My unhinged Twitter is at DDDecarbon, because my name is too long for those things. And then the same name for Reddit. And then otherwise, I try to put out weekly videos, but it can be a little bit difficult. Otherwise, I stream every Tuesday, and people can jump in and call and argue with me if they so feel. So,
For anybody who's listening to this, and that's D is in Delta, D is in Delta, D is in Delta, E is in Echo, carbon. You hit the last echo.
Yeah,
it's DDDecarbon, like decarbonization.
Yep, exactly. Yeah, my like I said, my Twitter is probably a little bit more unhinged, but it's how I've gotten this conversation and then my debate that I'm going to have in a month on nuclear power. So I don't know if that's the right positive feedback loop that I want, but talking shit on Twitter has gotten me a lot of content. So,
and yeah, it's pretty much what you do on Twitter. I mean, what everyone does. How do people follow your nuclear debate?
I will be streaming it. I think I'm in conversation with the guy, so we don't have all the details ironed out, but it's going to be July 21st. And you can just follow me on Twitter. I'll keep people posted about that. And then tomorrow I will have a Substack out with all of my references on why I am, or why I don't think we necessarily need nuclear. And he's going to provide me all of his references. And then we're going to have the debate, like I said, in a month. Yeah.
Good stuff. Should be fun. I'll try my best to watch it.
Yeah, for sure. It should. It'll appear on my channel as well. So if anybody isn't super keen, but yeah. Otherwise, Tuesday nights I play Baldur's Gate with my character named Liberal Shill, and I try to make all of the all of the memeiest, I guess, liberal decisions that I can. So
you're gonna have to break that down for me. What is that? Baldur's Gate?
Sorry. So the dungeons part is Dungeons and Dragons, and Baldur's Gate 3 is a Dungeons and Dragons video game. So I play that, and because it's a role-playing game, I've named my character Liberal Shill, and you get a lot of options. Like you can, murder an entire camp of people, or you can save them, or you basically have unlimited options. So I try to role play the character as close to what I think a liberal shill would be, because I get often called a liberal shill, so I think it's funny.
I think my producer, I'm just going to tell him there's no point uploading this to YouTube. They're going to insta ban it and murdering an entire village.
Yeah. Anyway, that's all from me.
Well, I just want to thank you very much for coming on. It was a really educational series, and I'll get you back on for your comments on immigration. But yeah, thank you very much, and have a wonderful day.
Yeah, you as well. Thanks, buddy.
Take care.